Hey guys, LevelCap here, and today I want to talk about the new RTX 3080 video card and one of the most important new features now available in many Nvidia GPUs, and that is called Reflex. Also, I'd like to give Nvidia a huge shout out for sponsoring this video. Now, it's no secret that the raw performance upgrade with the new RTX 3080 is massive, even when compared to the previous generation King of the Hill, the 2080 Ti. That's actually the card that I upgraded from, and it's without a question no slouch. But even when playing games at 1440p, I was seeing a gain between 20 to 30% in FPS, of course depending on the game, but that is still massive. This often means a gain of 25 frames per second or even more, which is absolutely crazy. Games feel so much more fluid, and titles that you might have only dreamed of playing at a stable 144 frames per second several years ago are now possible at that frame rate today. On top of that, when playing at even higher resolutions like 4K and when enabling even more advanced graphics features, the performance difference between current gen and last gen is even more substantial. And crazily enough, one of the coolest features that's been rolled out with the launch of the 3080 but not relegated to only next gen is called Nvidia Reflex, which is a driver upgrade that dramatically reduces system latency in supported games. Now, every gamer that's been serious about their gaming in the past several years has probably contended with system latency issues at one point or another. About a year ago, YouTuber Battle Nonsense published a video detailing how when your GPU reaches maximum utilization, you get increased input lag. Basically, this is the increased delay between when you click a button and the action happening in-game. So it's a pretty bad thing, especially if you're competitive. And while you might not always notice it specifically, it can make demanding games feel extremely sluggish or unresponsive. In that video, Battle Nonsense talked about Nvidia's then new ultra-low latency option. This is a driver-level setting that lets you adjust how the render queue of your game works. In very simple terms, your GPU will render frames as fast as possible, with as few being stored in queue without being processed and displayed. The ultra-low latency setting let you reduce the number of frames stored in render queue, which could be used to reduce your input lag at the expense of in-game frame rate. So if you're running a game at something way above your display's refresh rate, you could use ultra-low latency to improve your input lag. Now, unfortunately, this solution implemented back then just really wasn't ideal, especially for people that were going in and tinkering things manually. It was just a little too much work to try and get your game performing well. And that's what Nvidia's new in-game setting solution Reflex is for. Instead of manually configuring the render queue via ultra-low latency mode, Reflex hands the control over to the game and lets it prioritize how quickly and often frames get sent through the render queue. In essence, it tries to keep the render queue empty while rendering as many frames as possible. So in situations where a game is GPU bound, like at a high resolution or with lots of settings cranked all the way up, Reflex can really help stabilize your input delay and reduce it overall. Now, what's so cool about this driver update is that it's not just available on current gen GPUs. And for the purposes of showing just how effective it is on previous gen, we ran some tests on a RTX 2080 that's a pretty common last gen GPU that I'd imagine a lot of gamers have. And frankly, you can test out Reflex on your own provided that you have a GTX 900 series or newer, which should really cover the majority of people playing modern FPS games like Call of Duty. Naturally, first things first, we had to test this out in the Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War beta. With Reflex disabled, the render latency reported in the Nvidia overlay fluctuated between 10 to 13 milliseconds with a lot of variability. Now, having a lot of variability in that latency is extremely bad, and it usually means that when there's a lot of things happening on screen, basically your latency is going to become worse and your consistency in game is also going to become worse. Now, we ran the test with an unlocked FPS and all the in-game settings maxed out to try and make the game as much GPU bound as possible. Now, with Reflex enabled, the range fluctuated slightly from 10 to 12 milliseconds, but the overall variability was way down. Render latency was more consistent, and in some situations I could definitely feel the game stalling or being sluggish without using Reflex. Now, where things get really interesting is when you fully max out your GPU with stuff like ray tracing. Ray tracing at itself is extremely demanding for most GPUs and adds additional delay to a rendered frame. Nvidia's big innovation wasn't so much getting ray tracing to work in games, it was reducing that render delay. In Modern Warfare, at max settings with ray tracing turned on, the render delay bounced around the 20 millisecond range. That's extremely noticeable, especially on an RTX 2080, which only gets around 70 FPS on a demanding map like Oil Rig. But with Reflex enabled, that render latency drops to an average of 15 milliseconds. That's almost a 30% reduction in rendering latency per frame at 70 FPS. And while I'm not going to say that turning on Reflex will suddenly make you an esports legend, I will say that it offers a mathematically significant advantage in games that are very GPU heavy, and especially in games that support ray tracing. Having less input delay is absolutely a good thing, and it should be something that all gamers are striving to achieve, and the fact that we are able to get a 30% improvement using Reflex is massive. And certainly that percentage could fluctuate depending on the game, what hardware you're using, and whatnot. If you want to do your own testing, like I said, all you need is a GTX 900 series or newer GPU. Right now, the games that support Reflex are Fortnite, Modern Warfare, Apex Legends, and Valorant. You can also enable in-game performance overlay using GeForce Experience, though you're going to have to make sure that you're on the beta branch to enable this setting, and then use the Alt+R to display the performance graphs in-game. You can also pick which corner it's displayed in and change how much info is shown in the overlay preferences. One quick thing to note is that Reflex On and Reflex Boosted both do the same thing, but Boosted sets the GPU power preferences to maximum. So if you're trying to keep the heat down or conserve power, I'd recommend not using the boosted option. It is, however, what I used for all of my testing. Now, I gotta say, I couldn't be more excited about what Nvidia is doing both on the hardware side and software side of the equation. The 3080 is just a powerhouse of a GPU. It makes every single game I've been playing before play at a higher frame rate. I can even turn up new graphics settings and still play with increased FPS. It's absolutely phenomenal. It's making me even think about what games I might want to try playing more in 4K, as that's becoming more and more of a reality, even for somebody who likes high frames per second. And on the software side, Reflex seems like the ultimate solution to getting that input delay as low as possible without having to really study GPU drivers and what games are affected in different ways. Allowing Nvidia and game developers to handle it on their end is phenomenal. It means that over the next year, the more games that enable Reflex support will see massive benefits in input delay, and it'll make those games just feel so much more smooth and so much more enjoyable regardless of the overall frame rate. It is awesome. Nvidia, in my opinion, is attacking things on both fronts in the best way possible. Increasing your FPS with next generation video cards that offer substantial performance upgrades, and reducing your input latency with driver upgrades that even work for old gen cards. I think this overall upgrade for software and hardware is just phenomenal. Anyway guys, thanks for watching. In case you couldn't tell, I am over the moon with the performance of the new 3080. Thank you again to Nvidia for sending me one and sponsoring this video. Thanks guys, and I'll see you next time. This is LevelCap signing off.